evening, folks, and welcome back to Bison Chat. Galen Clavio joining you here as we get set for some excellent IU football talk, as we've got a lot to talk about tonight. The college football playoff rankings are out. We're going to break those down in grave detail. We've got a game to recap from this last weekend, Indiana pulverizing Michigan State in East Lansing, and then, of course, a huge game coming up this Saturday as Indiana hosts Michigan in one of the most pivotal games in the history of the program. No pressure, anybody. But joined, as always, by Joe Cronin, my co-host. Joe, good to see you again. How you doing on this rainy evening in Indiana?
I'm good. The rain caught me off guard. I was leaving my class, and then me and Austin Platt, fellow student, and Sam Brunsman, we had to record our Quest for Nine Indiana men's soccer podcast, and I was heading back to my place. And it just started pouring. I was like, oh, you got to be kidding me. I was in shorts and a T-shirt, so got home drenched, hair just fully wet, but took a nap. We rallied. A lot of big national news with the college football playoff, trade deadline in the NFL, and then Tuesday night action. Great football night, right?
I'm really impressed at your bounce-back ability and getting a little bit of rest before a big night of everything going on across not just college football, but some other things going on in the country as well that would be big. So good on you. We've also got Zach Browning joining us from NBC Sports and from other venues. Zach, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for having me back on. As you mentioned, though, nothing else going on in the country right now other than some IU football talk.
That's all there is to talk about, and so that's all we're going to hit. But, yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into it, folks, as we've got a lot of playoff talk. The first rankings come out, and Indiana comes in ranked, well, number 8, but actually number 9. It was a bit confusing, and we'll explain why. But Indiana in the college football playoff rankings, which is always nice. Like there was a world where they weren't actually in the college football playoff rankings, but as I noted somebody earlier on tonight saying, Indiana's never not been in the 12-team college football playoff rankings. So some good stuff happening. You can see the bracket. I'm going to put it up here for those of you that are watching. Ignore the ridiculous thing that this guy Brandon Walker is saying. I'm just going to block it there so you're not seeing his ridiculous words. But Indiana, 9 seed. They would technically be 8 seed, but because BYU in this scenario is the Big 12 champ, they get the 4 seed and the bye. So Indiana ends up falling down, and instead of hosting a game in this bracket, they would actually be traveling on the road to take Tennessee on. These are very premature. Like, we've got still like several weeks until we actually have to worry about any of this stuff, but you can see the rest of the bracket. Indiana, not the last team in. They were actually 4 in from the bottom of the bubble. The last team into this mix, Boise State as the group of 5 champion. And then, of course, Alabama is the 11 seed. Notre Dame is the 10 seed. And then Indiana would be ahead of BYU if BYU wasn't leading the Big 12. Some other notable items here. You've got Tennessee is the 8th seed here, even though they're 7th ranked overall. You've got Texas as another SEC team in this mix. You've got Penn State. And we're going to talk about the Nittany Lions here in a little bit. And then your 4 projected conference champions based upon today: BYU, Georgia, Miami out of the ACC, and then, of course, Oregon. Guys, let me go around the table here first and foremost and get your reactions to what we saw. Zach, you're the guest, so let's get your thoughts first on these the rankings, the reveal, everything.
Well, first off, I thought the reveal was done well. We're just gonna give a shout out to Reese Davis. That intro video was fantastic. I enjoyed it thoroughly. But coming into tonight, I was back and forth on whether Indiana would be an 8 or 9 seed / ranking, whatever you want to call it. I was assuming they'd probably maybe be that 8 seed. Said they're the 9 seed, but I think it's kind of telling how the committee kind of values the strength of schedule, and it's been the big thing that's been talked about throughout these rankings and throughout the run-up and lead-up to these rankings is strength of schedule. That's kind of the biggest thing holding Indiana back on a national perspective, is the fact that the Hoosiers haven't necessarily played anybody of a super high caliber up to this point in the season. So that's why Tennessee ahead of Indiana. Surprising to some. I go back and forth on it. Yes, Tennessee has 1 loss. Yes, that 1 loss was to a not very good Arkansas team. That win over what was then a ranked Oklahoma team, not looking so good. But, of course, Tennessee does have that win over Alabama. So it's all about that strength of schedule, and I think that's where we see these rankings kind of fall into line.
Yeah. Joe, your thoughts?
I mean, something that Reese Davis said at the top of the show was you'd be surprised by how similar that the AP poll and the college football playoff rankings are. And they're nearly identical for this ranking outside of Georgia and Ohio State being flipped at the 2 and the 3 in the respective regards. And I know there's been some remarks about Penn State. The issue is it's hard to punish a team when they're losing to what is the viewpoint as the second best team in the country. So they're not going to have that much slippage from that. Yes, they have a loss as compared to an undefeated Indiana, but they value that resume so much. It's why BYU is ranked the way they are, because they just don't think BYU has the strength of schedule to really put that then into the upper echelon. And some of the guys on the show, they felt like BYU is getting hosed a little bit here and there just from the fact they're also undefeated, could be a conference champion, and they don't have a ton of wiggle room at the spot. Like Indiana has more wiggle room right now than BYU, who's a projected conference champion. So that was interesting. I think they went right around where I thought they would go, right in that 8-9 spot. I think it would be really cool either way, whether they're able to host a game, whether they're on the road at Neyland Stadium. I mean, that would be a spiritual experience to see kind of that SEC culture, especially out in Knoxville, but not upset by it. I think they fit in well where Indiana had what they've done so far in the season and how they're ranking going forward. And it's really, they control their own destiny for being able to make it and kind of where they see it as well.
Yeah, I got to agree with you guys. I thought Indiana would be in that 7 to 8 range. So 9 is not that far off, obviously. And I was interested in, some of the things that the committee was going to try to take into account. And the problem, and I'm actually sympathetic to some degree to committees when it comes to these things, because these are not apples to apples comparisons. Yes, Indiana's got a weaker strength of schedule, as I think ESPN is contractually obligated to mention every sentence that they utter. It's kind of wild, but I'll also note that Indiana has a top 10 FPI ranking, which is a power ranking that takes into account how well you're playing on both sides of the ball, who you've played against, and so on and so forth, and certainly the level to which you have beaten those teams. And it's tough because, you can complain about BYU as they did on the show and say, well, God, BYU's won at SMU, or BYU blew out Kansas State, but BYU also barely beat Oklahoma State. They only won it by 6 at Baylor, who's not that great of a team. If you look at BYU's FPI, they're 28th in the country. I mean, that's a problem if you're BYU. You're just not winning games by that much. And then, you look at a team like Penn State, and this is where you just kind of know what you're getting when it comes to college football and rankings, whether it's a committee or whether it's a poll. I've been arguing for a while, like you go down the list of what Penn State has done overall on this season, Zach. I mean, they have a 3-point win at USC. They have a 15-point win. There's a lot of noise coming over the speakers here, guys. I'm not sure what's going on. But we have a 15-point win at Wisconsin. And then they got a bunch of nothing else. Like they've beaten West Virginia, Bowling Green, Kent State, Illinois, and UCLA, all by lesser margins than Indiana has beat their opponents. And then they lose at home to Ohio State. I mean, it's just one of those things where I'm not sure why they're getting credit to the point that they're a couple of spots ahead of Indiana. But as Joe pointed out, Zach, the nice thing for Indiana is, A, they're undefeated, and very few other teams in this mix can say that. And B, they have a stronger strength of schedule going forward than what they've had coming up to this point, which will even those things out a bit.
Exactly. You got Michigan coming up, obviously that date with Ohio State in Columbus as well in a few weeks' time. My biggest thing, though, when you're talking about this BYU-Indiana discussion, Indiana 8, BYU 9, as far as the rankings are concerned, it's interesting to me, the argument between strength of schedule, because if you look at BYU, yes, they've got that win against SMU. Theoretically, their strength of schedule, if you want to take it for what it is probably better than Indiana's. They have that road win against another team that's shown up in these rankings within the top 13 of these rankings, with SMU being at number 13. But clearly the community is not weighing BYU's strength of schedule over Indiana's strength of schedule and what Indiana has done. They both not lost a game. They're both undefeated. But despite BYU maybe having that bigger win against SMU on the road, BYU is still lower than Indiana. So I'm curious what the difference between Indiana versus BYU is versus maybe Indiana and Tennessee. Indiana obviously doesn't have the loss that Tennessee has. So it's a little bit curious to me what and how much the strength of schedule actually matters in the minds of the committee, because obviously BYU, again, They have that road win against SMU, so their strength of schedule is probably slightly better than Indiana's, but yet Indiana's still ranked ahead of them. So then why is Indiana not ranked ahead of Tennessee? Because Indiana's strength of schedule might be worse than Tennessee, but again, what they've done and the schedule that they've played and who's been put in front of them, there's not really anything or anybody that can detract from what Indiana's done. They've beaten everybody in front of them, and they've done it very, very handily.
Joe, as you look at what Indiana's got coming up, obviously you've got this game against Michigan, you got the game at Ohio State, you got the home game against Purdue. You look at these teams, and I think one of the things that's important for people to keep in mind, and I want to call this up so that everybody's just aware of some of the things that are going to be notable as we move forward. Like, this is the first picture of the college football playoff, and it's by no means the last time we're going to see these things change. And I wanted to call this particular tweet up that I sent out earlier because I think it's important to realize that between now and the end of conference championships, all of the following things that you see on the screen have to happen because these teams are playing each other. Texas and A&M play each other. Alabama and LSU play each other. Georgia plays Ole Miss. Georgia plays Tennessee. Notre Dame plays Army. Clemson plays Pitt. Iowa State plays K-State. There's going to be two teams in the SEC title game. One of them is going to lose a game. One of the ACC teams is going to lose a game. And then one of the Big 12 teams is going to lose a game. And, this is where, as much as it might feel like you need to overreact and say, wow, Indiana's too low or Indiana doesn't have a lot of margin. Like, even if Indiana loses to Ohio State, and this is where I get annoyed with ESPN's proclamation that, well, Indiana better win that Ohio State game or they might be left out. It's like Indiana's going to, even in that scenario, if they beat Michigan, which is an if, it's not a guarantee, and if they beat Purdue, you're 11-1 in the Big Ten with one of the best strength of record rankings in the entire country. You're going to be still top 10, maybe top 12 FPI. You're in a lot better shape than a 2 or 3 loss SEC team or ACC team. I think that's something that you can kind of take some solace in as an Indiana fan. It's not like you have to run the table. You're going to get left out, even though that might be what it looks like based upon the rankings right now. Joe? Can you guys hear me?
I got you.
Okay, Joe may be frozen. So Joe's
yeah,
yeah, you guys, you're having some internet issues at the house, I think. Well, Joe, I mean,
the house is having some internet issues right now.
No, it's fine. Zach, why don't you dive in?
I mean, with
go ahead.
Who's got it? I'll go ahead.
You
I
go.
got it. Well, exactly. These things, and again, it's the first rendition of these rankings. These things kind of have a way of just figuring themselves out. Talk about the committee's job right now is much easier than the committee's job will be in a couple weeks' time once all these SEC teams have taken on each other. You mentioned teams like Georgia, Alabama. Alabama's got 2 losses. Can they realistically afford another loss? Probably not. That third loss for Alabama would likely see them out. And then once the end of the season comes and you're weighing potentially a 1-loss Big Ten team versus a 2-loss SEC team, it's going to be decisions for the committee once that time comes. But the thing with that is, again, they'll work itself out. It will work itself out. The SEC teams are really just going to pick each other apart. The Big Ten teams, not so much because Ohio State's already played Penn State. Ohio State's already played Oregon. Indiana and Ohio State are upcoming. The Big Ten teams are likely going to finish each with 1 loss, or Oregon potentially undefeated. But the conversation gets a little bit more dicey and a little bit more tricky when you start factoring in the SEC teams. A handful of them could be 2-loss teams. A handful could even be 3-loss teams. How does the committee weigh that if it's a loss against a team like Texas or against a team like Tennessee? When they're losses against each other, it'll be interesting to see how the committee kind of plays that out.
Go ahead, Joe.
I just want to go back to your point that you made about, like, Indiana doesn't necessarily have to run the table. And I think that's true. I think they do have a wiggle room with pending. They go 2-1 with that loss to Ohio State. And if that is competitive as well, if they lose by 70, maybe the committee says, that's an issue right there. But if that doesn't happen, if they play close loss against Ohio State, one of the best teams in the country, a top 2 team, according to the college football playoff rankings, in one of the toughest places to play in Columbus, Ohio, at the Shoe, I think they're in. It's hard to push them out, especially being at that 8 spot. They have a little bit of wiggle room for a top 2 loss that allows some of that to happen.
People around the country, some people at least, some pundits, not happy with where Indiana's at. They feel like they're too low. Joel Klatt, who we know from Fox, the
He's
lead
a big fan.
commentator, big fan.
Yeah.
His quote on X: "Any blue blood with Indiana football's resume would be at worst number 4. The disrespect to the Hoosiers is real." We got Dan Orlovsky, ESPN commentator, saying Indiana at 9 is a complete and utter joke. We've had a couple of others like that as well. And
I mean, even at the top of the show, Booger McFarland was saying Indiana's going to get disrespected, and they're jawing back. Like
Ari Wasserman saying Indiana being ranked behind Penn State is BS, straight BS. It's going to be interesting. This is divisive. I'm really fascinated to see how this works moving forward. I'll tell you who is not worried about the rankings right now is Curt Cignetti. He was asked about whether they were going to be watching the show in his presser on Monday. Here's what he had to say.
I mean, I'll see the rankings, but the only thing that really matters is that you get the result on, when you play. And to do that, you got to keep the main thing, and eliminate the noise and the clutter, and stay focused on what's going to help you play your best on Saturday to give you the best chance to get the result. Every week presents its own new set of circumstances, and so there's a lot of that going on this week. I'm aware of it. But to get kind of caught up on that and lose your focus would be the kiss of death.
He's right. It would be the kiss of death. And it's interesting because I almost would argue that what we've seen in the college football playoff committee ranking here kind of feeds in to Curt Cignetti and how he would want to approach coaching this team going into this Michigan game. I mean, not that you need to get your team focused, because it's Michigan and it's a huge game in its own right, but you can very easily walk into the locker room tomorrow and say, guys, they don't want you in the college football playoff. Like they're setting you up to fail here. And to try to light a fire under your team when they're 9-0 and have played as well as Indiana's played is very difficult. But Curt Cignetti keeps getting handed little motivational things that he can bring into that locker room, Zach Browning, whether it's the AP poll, whether it's this, whether it's some of the commentary just in general. It is really fascinating for a guy like Cignetti who loves to play probably internally that disrespect angle to try to get his guys fired up. This is perfect, right?
Well, and it's absolutely perfect not only for him, but for the players as well. You've got 13 guys that came over from James Madison, a Sun Belt conference, a Group of 5 conference. Those guys are now on the big stage in the Big Ten, but they still necessarily don't feel like they're getting that Big Ten level of recognition. So I think that only feeds to the kind of hunger as well. And I think going back real quick to the college football rankings, it's made its way around social media this week, and the comparison between Indiana at this point in the season and Michigan, the national champions at this point in last season, and how similar the teams are in terms of their strength of schedule, in terms of how much they're dominating opponents. And Michigan last season at this time was ranked number 2 in the country. Indiana obviously coming in not number 2 in the country, number 8 with the ranking number 9. So number 8 seed. So I think that's just interesting, the kind of brand name that Michigan is versus what Indiana is. So I think it's, again, just more fuel to the fire for Curt Cignetti. And I think the players, they are ready to jump on anything that can give them that extra edge.
Joe, any other thoughts on that front? I mean, Indiana, obviously, this is a big game this week. We're going to talk about how big it is and why later on. But the college football playoff rankings release had the potential to be a distraction. It's something that players can get caught up in. This group's been really good so far about not getting caught up in all of these extra things that we're not used to, whether it's game day or big noon kickoff or whatever. Here's another one of those items, but it's clear from this that Indiana isn't safe in the college football playoff. They've still got work to do. How do you think that plays in the locker room?
I mean, it just gives them more fuel, honestly. These are level-headed guys, and yeah, they've had moments to kind of relish in the glory that they've had so far, and they've been asked, hey, I mean, how does it feel like, Bloomington, IU is all kind of falling in love with this team? They enjoy it, but they are also playing with this next day mentality, next play mentality. I mean, they play every snap like it is their last, like they're trailing, like they have something to prove. I mean, they beat Michigan State by 37 and in the fourth quarter held them to 0 yards when it was already a blowout. It's just stuff like that. They have this mentality that they're going to go in and steal the soul from the other team, and they've been able to do that. I mean, got to talk to CJ West earlier today, and it was just like, hey, Michigan defending national champions, everything riding on this one, second to last home game, stuff like that. And he's like, this is the most important game because it's the next one. And that's verbatim of what Cignetti's been saying all year. But the team is purely like based off of what he's been able to lead, and it's lead by example, and they follow that chain of command so well. And I think because of the mentality that Cignetti has implemented with this team, the ability of the team to follow along with it with so many guys that already understood what it took, adding those new guys like CJ West, like Curtis Rourke, Miles Price, those guys came in from different places, Justice Ellison from Wake Forest. They were able to buy into this mentality because they saw the core group already have it. And then when they believe, they're able to just go and show the country now that they belong. And there really is nothing besides the outside noise saying, oh, their strength of schedule, this, blah, blah. It's Indiana, this. They've been able to play within themselves at a tremendous level and just block out everything.
There was a question here from Nick Barna. Serious question. With the conference realignments, how are schedules determined? Is there any rotation or is it a random computer assignment each year? So there's kind of two different components. There's really three different components to the schedule that are worth keeping in mind. So A, you have your non-conference, which is entirely determined by the teams. So like Indiana chose this year to buy out the Louisville game, replace that with, I think, the Charlotte game. And so they ended up with Western Illinois, FIU, and Charlotte. Weaker schedule, but that was on purpose and a good idea because Indiana needed kind of a long runway with a new coach, new coaching staff, new team coming in to kind of get their feet under them. If you look at their future schedules as far as non-conference, like next year, they've already got their non-conference set. It's not very good. They're playing Old Dominion, Kennesaw State, and Indiana State in the first 3 weeks of the season.
Powerhouses.
Powerhouses right there. But again, you normally make up for that in the Big Ten, which they do next year, and we'll talk about in a second. But you go forward, like they're playing Colorado State and UConn in the non-conference in 26. They have
Notre Dame in 28, right? Or 2030, something like that?
Notre Dame is in 30 and 31. Joe, you will be middle-aged by the time they play Notre Dame.
That's scary. That's scary.
It is frightening. But the way that the Big Ten schedules work is that there's a couple of things. There's certain locked-in games that you're going to play every year. So Indiana has two of those. They play Purdue every year. They play Michigan State every year because those are protected rivalry games. Some teams have more than two. Some teams only have one. But Indiana has those two. And then they've got 1 year, like this year for Indiana, you play 5 home games and 4 road games in the conference. And then it flips the following year where you play 4 road games and 5 home games. And so what Indiana's doing next year is there. I'll just show you the schedule. Why talk about it when we could actually demonstrate it? This is what Indiana's doing next year. So Old Dominion, Kennesaw State, Indiana State. Then they've got
gauntlet.
Then this is not in order, but it's a tougher schedule than this year. You got to go to Penn State. You got to go to Oregon. You got to go to Maryland. You got to go to Iowa. You get Illinois, Michigan State, UCLA, and Wisconsin at home, and you got to go to Purdue. We know that game is going to be at the end of the season. It's not as bad. There's no Ohio State on the schedule next year. There's no Michigan on the schedule next year. You do get Penn State back in Happy Valley, and you got to go to Oregon. But the rest of the schedule is frankly somewhat manageable. And so, what they do across the board, they have been trying to rotate the road matchups for teams against Pac-12 or former Pac-12 competition. So like this year, Indiana was at UCLA, and then they play Washington at home. Next year, they're going to go to Oregon, but they get UCLA at home. The year after that, they go to Washington, and I think they get USC at home, and then they flip that in the following year. Now, this is assuming they're not going to add any more teams to the Big Ten, but this is essentially how the scheduling process goes. So hopefully that's helpful to you, Nick, and anybody else that was curious how all that stuff works. So anyway, any final thoughts on the CFP stuff, guys, before we jump back in time and talk about the Michigan State game this weekend?
No, I just think it'll be exciting to kind of track the next couple weeks, see how things go, especially after this week, how much motion is there off a win, how much, like you said, look at the schedule remaining for some of those already ranked teams that are within that top 12 and how that's going to shape out. It'll be fun.
It will be fun. And you know what else was fun? Indiana waxing Michigan State and East Lansing this past weekend. Let's hear what Curt Cignetti had to say on that game.
I like the way we responded when we were down 10-0 in the first quarter. Guys kept their poise, kept playing, no frustration. And picked up a couple turnovers there defensively in the second quarter, which were key. Scored 47 straight points and really dominated the line of scrimmage up front on defense. 7 sacks, 15 tackles for loss. Made some big plays in the punt return game. Blocked a punt, forced a muff, which also led to a touchdown. Had a couple big returns and also got a deflection at the end of the game on a punt.
It was a tremendous game defensively for Indiana. I mean, just up and down the board. Their rough start, although, yeah, you go back and watch the highlights, Joe, and Michigan State made some out-of-their-mind plays on those first couple of drives, which I think we just assumed that was going to happen the whole game. But Indiana buckled down, and the last three quarters of that game, the defensive line especially, was just a group of monsters against this Spartan squad.
Yeah, I have never seen a conference game have that drastic of a difference between fronts, like dominating like that. 15 tackles for loss. They were just living in the backfield. It wasn't even like the Spartan offensive line was just opening up immediately. Michael Kamara, 4.5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks. Michigan State had negative 36 rushing yards at the end of the game. They lost 93 yards. They had gained like 60-something and whatever the math is and lost 93 on the game. That is ridiculous just to show what they did defensively. And then the response, too, offensively, you're down 10-0. This is the big drive right there. They orchestrate long drive down the field. Zach Horton gets the score, and then defense turns around and gets an interception. And that's when they started to see the things start to click correctly. And it was really interesting. I mean, we tried to ask every player in the availability. I think we got, Aiden Fisher was there, Curtis Rourke, Michael Kamara. I think Elijah Surratt was also there. There were 4 guys that talked, and we were all like, hey, what was that message? You're down 10-0. And I was like, nothing really. Like, we just stick to our game. And obviously with Signetti on Saturday as well, he was like, now you guys know what happens when we trail a game. The sample size for IU trailing in a game is 47 straight points. That's crazy. Wrapping my head around that is crazy. This team on both sides, all 3 levels, are fantastic. Like, the fact that at all 3 levels, they are top 10 categories. I mean, they haven't missed an extra point, haven't missed a field goal. Nicholas Radicic has been great at his spot. Hasn't really been challenged all that much for long field goals, but I mean, consistency is key, right?
Aiden Fisher had some talk about the process and how they process these things. We heard from him after the game.
It's huge. You're down by 10 or you're up by 37 at the end of the game. He's the same guy, and that kind of speaks volumes to your team. So no matter what, you don't need to get too high, you don't need to get too low. Just stay right in that middle and be consistent within your work. And each play is new, so no need to hang your head or praise yourself for a play before.
Yeah, Zach, a big contrast to what Indiana's had the last few years versus this year. I mean, it's very even-keeled. It's very level. It's not ramped up like let's get all excited. And it's interesting because you watch this team and you watch the way they execute down the stretch and the way it builds and builds. And I heard like on Every Day Should Be Saturday or on a Shutdown Fullcast, the Spencer Hall's podcast, like they're talking about like Indiana's just constantly cashing checks. Like they're constantly putting pressure on you. And that causes your offense to do things that it doesn't want to do because it has to try to keep up. And you could see Michigan State getting caught in that quicksand as the second quarter, third quarter went on. And they couldn't do anything about it. Like, it was really remarkable. And, we've seen Indiana do this now multiple times this season, but this was really the first time in a hostile road environment with 50,000, 60,000 opposing fans that Indiana did it. And they looked better than, even in some of the home games they've had so far this season doing it.
That's the crazy part. We've talked about Indiana's season-long dominance, and outside of the Nebraska game, this might be the most dominant Indiana look, despite trailing for the first time. I mean, 47 straight points unanswered against any team, let alone a power conference team, a Big Ten team on the road, is spectacular. And it just talks about the complementary football that this team plays. Joe talked about the fact that all 3 phases were able to dominate on Saturday against the Spartans, and it's what they've echoed all season long. When the defense gets to stop, the offense is there to contribute and convert those turnovers into points. The defense gets an interception, the offense there scores. The defense maybe gives up 10 first quarter points, the offense scores 47 in the final 3 quarters. The offense struggles early on, the defense kind of limits the damage because, as we mentioned, that was a special start for Michigan State. Aiden Childs showed some really good things in that first quarter, but the defense only limited them two 10 points. That touchdown was great from Childs, that touchdown pass, but holding them to a field goal on that first drive of the game, that's a big play by the defense, especially when the offense started out with 2 straight 3-and-outs. So it's just a complimentary football. It's Curtis Rourke coming back from his injury, had surgery less than 2 weeks prior to that game, and you wouldn't have known it. He didn't look like it. 263 yards, 4 touchdowns on the day for him. And it's the weapons, the amount of weapons. You look at Aiden Fisher, his linebacking partner doesn't get talked about enough. Jalen Walker, the stuff he does, not only in the pass rush, not only stopping the run, but in the pass coverage game as well. Offensively, Curtis Rourke's throwing to 4 different guys that could start at pretty much any other Big Ten school outside at the receiver position. The running backs, the trio of running backs really that Indiana uses are all talented. They could all rush for 1,000 yards in a single season if they were that single workhorse back. It's just the talent is there in Indiana, and credit the coaching staff to be able to put that talent and put those players in the right positions to make those plays and to succeed.
This is a question from Matt Uhl, which I think is an interesting one, and I'm curious your guys' take. Is there momentum or is there evidence that each of the units is still improving and maturing here in November? Do you think IU has yet to play their best complete game? Joe, let me start you with that one.
It's interesting because you look at that Michigan State game and you can almost say to that point, but again, they were down 10-0 after the first quarter. So that's not a complete game. They were trailing. And they still, held them to 0 yards in the fourth quarter, scored 47 unanswered. Curtis Rourke had 4 touchdowns. They had over 100 yards on the ground. It's hard to tell, where the points are that's hey, this needs improving, because does the defensive line have that kind of performance moving forward? I think that's tough to replicate something like that. I think they need to be disruptive. They need to get in the backfield, have 2 to 3 sacks. I mean, they have 31 sacks on the year. They're top echelon in the country just from those numbers alone. That was something very interesting I was looking at, just diving into some of the national stats. And they are top 10 in lots of major important categories, like third down conversion percentage, red zone touchdowns. They're first in the country in touchdowns in general. They are averaging the second most points per game. They are allowing the 7th fewest points per game, allowing the 3rd fewest yards per game. They're top 10 in yards per game. Looking at that at week 3 can be one thing when it's non-con in UCLA, but now it's week 9. This has been real for 9 straight weeks. So it's hard to see how much better they can get, because we're probably seeing maybe not the peak, because maybe that Ohio State game is really going to be, can they put together a complete game against a top caliber opponent? And that's going to be an interesting one. I know I don't want to overlook this Michigan game, but that's a game that Ohio State, if Indiana comes in 10-0, Ohio State 9-1. Ohio State has that now circled, knowing that Indiana wants to be the guys that belong with the big boys. And Ohio State, as this blue blood big boy, doesn't want that to happen. So definitely a lot of eyes the eyes of the country will be on that game. But regardless to that question, it's hard to tell whether they can play much better, but they've just been rolling from the start of the season to now. But there has been development, like FIU, there were things here and there, but that Michigan State game.
Zach, we'll stop the Michigan State conversation with the following. Mikhail Kamara wins 2 National Defensive Player of the Week awards, the Walter Camp Award and the Bednarik Award, but doesn't win Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week awards. Can you explain this to me? I'm just a simple brain. I don't quite understand it.
I don't know how it works either, because to me, 2.5 sacks, 4.5 tackles for a loss is not only worthy of National Player of the Week, like he got, rightfully so, but Big Ten Player of the Week as well. And it wasn't even just the fact that he got that kind of production. Obviously, the counting stats, the sacks, the tackles for loss, those are one thing. But the Pro Football Focus numbers, the advanced numbers, they love Mikhail Kamara. They love him. The QB hurries, the pressures, the win rate at the line on pass plays. They all love Mikhail Kamara, and it's he's dominating everybody, whether it's a Michigan State offensive lineman, Nebraska, who notoriously has pretty good offensive lines, dominating Nebraska too. No matter who it is, he's been fantastic. And to go back to that last question about what Indiana's really improved on the most this season, I was digging into the turnover numbers earlier this week. And through the first 3 games this season, the first 3 Big Ten games this season, Indiana was -2 in the turnover margin through the first 3 Big Ten games of the season. The most recent 3 Big Ten games, Indiana's +7. Stark difference there.
Yeah.
So the turnovers, they've been able to create more, but they've also been able to limit their own a little bit more.
I remember back after the Northwestern game where people were ready to throw the defense away. And we're like, well, the defense is holding this team back. And wow, have they stepped up over the course of the last few games. It's been really, really impressive to see. Indiana beats Michigan State, the third straight win in East Lansing for IU in a series that does not happen. Like, Indiana is so far behind in Michigan State in the all-time series between these two teams. It's not even funny, but that's a nice little streak that Indiana's got going up there in East Lansing. They now play the other team from Michigan, the Michigan Wolverines, who are not having a great season. They come off a national championship win last year, and they have struggled particularly on offense. Let's hear what Curt Cignetti has to say about the Wolverines.
Well, I mean, I look at them and I see a really good defense, really good special teams, and offensively, they haven't scored points. They're not in the 40s and 50s, but they can run the ball from 11, 12, and 13 personnel. They've got weapons. They've got good backs. They got good players, and they're a good football team. Coming in here with a lot of tradition, a lot of history, a lot of pride.
He kind of nailed it. Very concise and accurate description of Michigan. This is a team that, if you look at what they've done so far this season, they have been pretty similar in terms of results to some of the other teams that Indiana's played so far this year. I mean, I would lump them in with Michigan State. I'd lump them in with Washington. I'd lump them in with Nebraska to some degree. They're a team that has really struggled to score, and they're only averaging 21 points per game. You look at their overall record, their wins are against Fresno State, Arkansas State, USC by 3, Minnesota by 3, and Michigan State by 7. They have won games. All those games that they won have been at home, and they have struggled even in those games to put a lot of points on the board. Their losses so far on the season, they lose at home to Texas. No shame there, certainly. They lose at Washington 27-17. They lose at Illinois 21-7, a loss that looks less respectable by the week. And then, of course, they lose at home this past weekend to Oregon in a game that they were a little more competitive, Joe, than I think maybe people thought they might be, but they still lost that game 38-17. I mean, when you think about this Michigan team, they've been, the dominant storyline's kind of been their inability to settle on a quarterback. Alex Orji's played 8 games. Davis Warren's played 5. Jack Tuttle started a game and then retired due to injuries. Their quarterbacks are only averaging a completion percentage of 61%. They've thrown 10 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. Their offense has just not looked great, especially compared to what we saw last year.
Yeah, this is an interesting situation for Michigan because it very clearly on paper and everything from the eye test, this is not last year's Michigan Wolverines team. That team last year was very much set up to make the run. That was the team that Michigan was so desperately waiting for so long. Big credit there for Jim Harbaugh. And obviously the amount of draft picks they had, the amount of seniors that they lost, that's hard to replace, especially when they just brought in an inside hire rather than going and trying to, obviously that was the plan with Coach Sharon Moore. They didn't replenish as well as possible. And I think they're having a bit of that hangover from a national championship. And that's going to happen, especially when they didn't really reload to the abilities that they, some Alabamas and Georgias have in the past. This is an interesting game right now because I know I'm looking purely on stats. Indiana's allowing 72 yards on the ground a game. That is the fewest in the country by over 10 yards per game. Obviously, Michigan is a very ground-dominant team. They're not running the ball as well this year. Obviously, Donovan Edwards has really not been what he's been up to speed, injured here and there. And in the quarterback situation, they can't really pass the ball. So this is just, if Michigan wants to make this a game, they got to get the ball first, and they got to have a painfully slow, 8-minute drive where they're eating some clock, running the ball, 15, 18 plays, really punch Indiana in the mouth and get them all out of rhythm. Otherwise, this is not a Michigan team that's going to be able to play catch-up. If Indiana goes down, takes 3 minutes and scores, they might be in for a long day because they just don't have the talent on the outside. The quarterback is still, Davis Warren started the past 2. He looked better than what Michigan quarterbacks have been showing, but I don't know. This is nowhere near the Michigan team they were last year. I think they're solid. I mean, they realistically might end this year 6-6 and squeak into the Detroit Bowl, but we'll see.
It's Michigan. They get to a better bowl than that, I think. But no, Zach, it's a team that they've tried to hang their hat on some of the old school things that work in football. They focus there on their defense, and their defense has been pretty good. They focus on their running game. Kalel Mullings averaging over almost 5.5 yards a carry, 7 touchdowns, 710 yards through 9 games. Donovan Edwards has rushed for almost 500 yards. Like, they really have had to keep it on the ground. So to some degree, a big question in this one is, how does Indiana's defensive front match up against Michigan's offensive line? Normally, you'd be like, oh, that's a problem because Michigan's offensive lines are always incredible. And yet, you look at the way that this Indiana defensive line is pieced together, especially in the interior with West and Carpenter, and you've got the guys on the edges that are doing their thing. And it's like, well, if I was going to pick an Indiana defensive line to match up against a Michigan offensive line, particularly in the run game, looking at that Michigan State game as evidence, it's like I feel fairly good about where we're heading in this one.
You're exactly right. And the best part about that for Indiana heading into this game, it's not just going to be the front four, the front guys on the defensive line trying to stop the run game, because Indiana doesn't have to worry about a passing attack. So they can put 8 guys in the box and let D'Angelo Pons and Jameer Johnson cover guys one-on-one on the outside, because Davis Warren and really any Michigan quarterback so far this season has not been able to throw the ball. They just can't do it, at least with any consistency. So I think that's where the biggest problem kind of gets going for Michigan, is that teams don't have to just try and match up one-on-one with the offensive line, which is still good for Michigan. It's still a good offensive line, but the offensive line is not having to deal with 4 guys on the defensive front. They're having to deal with the linebackers, the safeties coming down and dropping into the box as well. And I think with Indiana, especially with Aiden Fisher, Jalen Walker, Sean Asbury, who's been great in the run support game, he's a great tackler. It's a group of Indiana defenders that they're all great tacklers. They're all great in the run game. So they're going to come down and disrupt those things down in the trenches. So Indiana is going to have to force Michigan to try and pass. And up to this point in the season, the Wolverines have really not shown an ability to be able to beat anybody through the air. So it's going to be interesting to see if Michigan can kind of break those tendencies and maybe get something going in the air, because they're going to need it.
I will say on the offensive side for Indiana, like going against, Michigan has always preached their very talented defense, big up front, good on the outsides. But with Indiana, I think having such a mature quarterback with Curtis Rourke, that he knows the reads he wants to make. And he's so delayed on those RPOs. And I think this is a chance to really punish what is glorified as this top defense, or has been in years past. And I don't know. I haven't liked the way Michigan has looked this year. I know they had so much change, but it's been underwhelming.
They haven't looked great. I mean, some of it is just the natural churn from winning a national title. Some of it's the coaching turnover. And I think as much as Jim Harbaugh wears on people, it's easy to forget he's a really good football coach, and he really knows what he's doing. And Sharon Moore was kind of the emotional hire after Harbaugh left, especially with that whole scene at Penn State last year where he's like crying on the field. That was, and it's tough. We're seeing this across the country. Like, it's hard to succeed coaches. We see this with Kalen DeBoer, who we know is a good coach. Even he's had trouble succeeding Nick Saban. I can only imagine what Sharon Moore's dealt with, but I do think it's important to note as we look at the bite-sized Bison preview numbers. And again, keep in mind, green is good, purple is bad. Indiana comes out looking really good statistically in this matchup. Michigan is, offensively, they're just not very good in terms of EPA per play. They just don't get a lot of expected points added on most of the plays that they run. They're slightly better in the run. They're pretty bad in the passing game. Defensively, Michigan has shown somewhat the ability to stop the pass and the run, but Indiana is so good at both of them. It's going to really be fascinating to see what exactly Michigan is able to do to try to slow down this Indiana attack, because they faced the only offense that Michigan has faced, I think you could argue, that is of the caliber of Indiana so far this season is Oregon, the team that they just played at home. They did not fare well trying to stop that attack. Now they got to go on the road to an Indiana team that is really firing on all cylinders right now and has shown, like, okay, if you're Washington and you're going to just shut down our passing game, we'll just run the ball down your throat. If you're Michigan State, you're like, we're going to shut down your running game. well, hell, that's fine. We're just going to pass around you. We're going to do reverses. We're going to get our guys into space. I mean, it's a daunting task for most defenses, but especially for this Michigan defense, was just by the numbers hasn't been that good so far this year, Zach.
Yeah, it's a Michigan defense. They've got talent, but it's not necessarily the traditional talent at entire position groups. I mean, you look at guys, Mason Graham and Will Johnson, those guys are still going to be top 10 picks this upcoming season. Mason Graham hasn't had the best season. Josiah Stewart's another great defensive end that they have. But those are really individual talents. It's not position group wide talents, and it's not a defensive wide talent that this Michigan defense has. So I think that's really where the depth of this Indiana offense comes into play. You're talking about that receiving core. You mentioned Will Johnson. Will Johnson can take one wide receiver out, but he can't guard more than one. And you've got maybe Elijah Surratt. He'll be matched up against this weekend. But then you look at Miles Price, Miles Cross. There's just so many guys and so many different names in this Indiana receiving core where Will Johnson can't do it all by himself. So it's going to be the third, the fourth cornerbacks in that secondary for Michigan that are really going to be tasked against Curtis Work in this offense. And then you look at that defensive line, Mason Graham, Josiah Stewart, those guys maybe slightly better in the pass rush department rather than the run stopping department. This Indiana offensive line, again, there's been nobody that has been able to stop them. A team that was much better statistically on paper, at least from a defensive standpoint. Nebraska, we saw what Indiana's offensive line did against that Nebraska defensive line. So I would agree that Michigan's defense is going to be searching for answers this Saturday.
Yeah, and Joe, this is one of those games where if you just look at it on paper and you look at where the two teams have played and you look at the statistics that have been accrued, it's like, well, no brainer. That's why Indiana's a 14-point favorite. And yet there's a psychological barrier when it comes to Michigan. This is a team that has had Indiana's number for 50 plus years.
Yep.
Indiana's won twice against Michigan since 1967. This is the first time Indiana's been favored against Michigan since 1968. You know, even in seasons when Michigan hasn't been good, Indiana hasn't been able to figure out a way to topple them. And it's a huge game, you know, and you take Michigan aside and say, well, that's a tough one because Indiana rarely ever beats Michigan. But then you also add in all the other things. You've got the chance to go 10-0, win 10 games for the first time in school history. The chance to, I'm not going to say sew up a college football playoff berth, but certainly at 10-0 with Purdue still on your schedule, you got to feel pretty confident about your chances. I mean, there's so much in this game. You got all these recruits coming in, you know, reports Julian Lewis might be coming. You got other recruits that are coming. It's a huge day just in general, another sellout in Memorial Stadium. And this is where it's like, you want to trust the team, you want to trust the coaches, but as a fan or as an observer of Indiana football, there's that thing in the back of your head where it's like, this is a game that normally Indiana hasn't been able to historically win. However, we could say that about pretty much all the games Indiana has won since the Charlotte game. So maybe we need to just not worry about that at all. But it is something that is right there in the forefront of a lot of people's minds in the fan base.
I mean, obviously that is the number one storyline regarding this team is, hey, this is the losingest football team, college football team of all time. First to 700 losses, everything like that. And here comes old Curt Cignetti trying to spark some type of culture into that. Through 9 weeks, it's almost at the point where this game right here, they can throw away 75 years of bad if they go 10-0. And you can almost disregard any Indiana history questions because they are now 10-0. And right now they've almost been able to do that considering they're 9-0. But this is the one where it's like, now the college football playoff ranking is official. Now it's like this dream has become a reality if they're able to play within themselves. I honestly think in these last 3 games, the biggest opponent that Indiana will have is themselves. They can play to Ohio State's level. I truly believe that simply from the eye test of both teams and also just the numbers that Indiana is putting up regardless of opponent. That is teams that only like the top of the top are able to do on both sides of the ball. It's you go back through the past national championship winners, the teams that were making the playoffs, the teams that were right on the outside. That is what the numbers Indiana is putting up through 9 weeks. And I don't think that's something that should be overlooked. I know football, there's a lot of external factors regardless than just the stat sheet, but they've passed the eye test. I mean, the biggest thing going into last week was what will happen when this team trails? They trail and put up 47 unanswered. That's what happens when they trail. They put the foot on the gas and just keep going. it has been extremely impressive to watch this team, and they're getting the national recognition they deserve. The name brand isn't quite there, so who knows what happens if they beat Michigan, whether they go up or down. But this team is real. I think the fans should rally around that. I mean, this is the realest thing that Indiana football has probably ever had. Not to throw shade, but I mean,
it's fair. You're probably right. It's just weird to think about. But yeah, no, ultimately, it's an immense game, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this Memorial Stadium crowd approaches this. A 3:30 game on CBS, marquee matchup. You're playing Michigan. Probably no question about getting up for this one, and it's going to be interesting. I mean, Zach, let's close it out with this question. We had a question coming in from I'm trying to find it here. Actually, where did it go? Oh, here it is, from Ryan Breach. Michigan has a highly rated defense, kind of. According to the traditional stats, yes. Do you see IU relying more on the run or the pass on Saturday? What would be your answer there, and why?
It's a tough question because this Indiana offense has been so balanced. I would say it's got to be a combination of both. If I had to choose one, it's probably going to be the run, because I see Indiana getting up early in this game. And while, yes, the passing attack and Curtis Rourke's been spectacular, I mean, he's talked about on the outside of the Heisman discussion, which is crazy to think about after coming over from Ohio. But I think it's going to be the run, just because that's going to be the thing that keeps that lead if Indiana does get out to that early. If Indiana is able to come out, get that lead early on, then they can kind of just put that game away behind the running game and kind of put the game to rest and put that game to bed by bleeding out the clock, just letting it go, pounding the ball down the throats of Michigan. And it's what we saw. Again, statistically speaking, this is a similar defense to Nebraska's of what we saw. And again, it was the run game that dominated the Cornhuskers in that game. It felt like almost in that Nebraska game that the Indiana offensive line took it as a challenge amongst themselves to kind of show that dominance and assert their dominance. I think we see that again on Saturday against Michigan. I think the run game will probably be leaned on a little bit more heavily to hold the lead. Maybe the passing game is relied upon to build the lead. But I think once Indiana, if they are able to get out to that comfortable 2-score lead, 10, 14, maybe even 17-point lead, I think it'll be the run game that'll be the closing and the closer that brings the win home for Indiana.
Yeah, the one thing I'm curious about, Joe, as I finish up with you here, is how Michigan chooses to try to attack Indiana defensively. I could see Michigan saying, we believe that we can overwhelm this Indiana offensive line, even though that offensive line has played incredibly so far. And it's a dangerous game that Michigan has to engage in one way or the other, because if they decide to jam up the run, Curtis Rourke's shown an ability to get the ball into space pretty easily and get to that second level defensively. If they choose to try to fall into pass coverage, well, they've Justice Ellison, Tyson Lawton, they've shown that they have the ability to run the ball, get up big chunks of yardage. So, ultimately, it's interesting because, if you look at S&P Plus, Michigan's 30th in the country. If you look at FPI, which doesn't really consider previous seasons, Michigan's only 46th in the country. And Indiana is 10th. And so that's why Indiana's got a 78% chance of victory in this one. They're considered essentially kind of almost a 3.5 to 1 favorite. It's really going to be interesting to see how Michigan comes out and tries to play this one. And I think Zach hit the nail on the head. If Indiana can get out and get a lead and start to control things, you really do put yourself in a position where Michigan, may just not be able to respond because they haven't shown an ability to put points on the board so far this year.
I was a little conflicted when going back and forth. Is it the run or the pass they rely on more? And I wanted to say the pass just because of the Michigan tried and true is stop the run and force the pass. But with Michigan, I feel like they're confident in the 4-down linemen that they have to be able to not allow Justice Ellison and Tyson Lawton to break into that second level, to try and get some contact at the line of scrimmage, force these 1-2 yard games, get them behind the sticks a little more. So I think the run game is going to be what Indiana relies on a little more, has some more of these run heavy packages, because I don't know if Michigan's going to come out and try to defend the run as hard as they might, because they do have the talent up front.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. We'll see what happens with the whole thing as we end up rolling into Saturday a lot. They did not rank Michigan in the CFP. Thank you, Elliot. But a lot riding on this game for Indiana, and certainly a chance to make a special season even more special as they move forward into the month of November, or as we are calling it on Crimson Cast, Suck Month, since these were the three teams, Michigan, Ohio State, and Purdue, that Kurt Signetti identified as sucking in its initial address to the IU fan base. We're getting the T-shirts made, okay? They should be out in about a week or so, I would hope. But
wait, what does the T-shirt say?
They just say Suck Month. I mean, what else do they
Oh my.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great.
Anyway, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. And I appreciate everybody for joining us here on this live Bison Chat on Tuesday night, or if you're listening afterwards, we certainly appreciate you joining us as well. Indiana, 8th in the CFP poll, 9th in the seeding due to the way that they do the bracketing. A good spot for Indiana to be in as they get ready for some incredibly consequential games here over the next 4 weeks of the college football season. Zach Browning, thank you for joining us once again on the show. We always appreciate you being here. We'll look forward to having you on the next time. Joe Cronin, thank you as well. Our thanks, as always, to the lovely Emily Fox, who was not pushing the buttons tonight, but uploaded all the videos. So we appreciate all the work that she did in making things happen. For all those folks, I'm Galen Clavio. Thanks for joining us. You can catch Bison Chat every Tuesday night here on the Back Home Network. Be sure to subscribe to the Back Home Network YouTube channel, as well as the Crimson Cast Substack. We will catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody. Still going. I'm not sure